Well, hello and welcome to our video instruction on fixed income basic concepts and the reading fixed income securities defining elements. So the keywords here are basic because this is pretty basic stuff, and defining elements, there's an awful lot of definitions here. So nothing difficult here. It's straightforward, it's easy, but some time is spent on it. Certainly could be some questions on it on the exam. So let's try and get these down and be very clear about what these terms mean, what they refer to, and how bonds work. This is certainly going to help when we get to further on in fixed income, where we talk about valuation and risk and other issues. But let's jump right into this and look first at the issuer. Now, when we have a bond, that's evidence of a loan. The company or the entity issuing the bond is borrowing the money. The bond says we're going to pay it back in this manner on these dates in these amounts, how that's going to be calculated or what those amounts are. And the bond buyer or the bond holder is the lender of the money. So we call these fixed income securities. We'll find out the income isn't really fixed. We could call them debt securities, and that's probably at least as common as calling them fixed income securities. So as far as the issuer, we want to know, well, who's borrowing the money, who's promising to repay it? And this could be a corporation, it could be a sovereign government, by which we mean a national government. Bank of Japan issuing government bonds, or U.S. Treasury bonds. These are sovereign governments that are the issuer. We can also have non-sovereign, it's just not that specific of a term anymore. Now, securitized bonds, excuse me, we mentioned earlier special purpose entities, or SPEs, set up for the special purpose of borrowing money and backing it with financial assets. So here's what goes on. You've got a company, say they've got some financial assets, say they've got some receivables, they've got a lot of credit card receivables on their books. What they do, the firm sells these assets, financial assets, to the special purpose entity. The special purpose entity issues bonds, borrows money to buy these assets. Well, the point is that now these assets are bankruptcy remote, meaning the company has sold them to a separate legal entity, the SPE. And so if the company gets into financial distress, bankruptcy, those assets aren't on the balance sheet or owned by the corporation anymore. So that makes this a little safer than a general claim against the corporation. And again, why would they do that? To lower their borrowing costs. Let's take these assets, put them in an SPE, borrow against those assets in the SPE, and so rather than leaving the assets on the balance sheet and borrowing the money, they take the assets off the balance sheet, sell them to the SPE to get the money, then the SPE becomes the issuer of the debt security, and it's the assets that have been sold to the SPE that make the payments. So they're separate from the firm. Some examples: huge business in mortgage-backed securities, where mortgages sold to an SPE, the SPE issues securities, the payments from the mortgages make the payments to the borrowers from the special purpose entity or special purpose vehicle. Examples, I think I mentioned credit card receivables, business loans, automobile loans, whatever you can think of as financial assets that have cash flows can be packaged up to support the borrowing of an SPE. Now, another term that you might run into is covered bonds. Covered bonds do essentially the same thing, but we run into them in Europe primarily. They've been extended to some other countries. But with a covered bond, instead of selling the assets to the SPE, the assets are segregated on the balance sheet of the issuer. And there's actual legislation in place that says, yes, you can segregate these assets. They're still owned by the firm and they're on the balance sheet, but it accomplishes what an SPE does in terms of being bankruptcy remote, but within the firm. Now, with this covered bond structure, the way it's set up, if the assets that the firm has segregated to make the payments on these covered bonds don't support those payments, or their value declines so they don't really support this covered bond issue, periodically the firm has to augment these assets. It has to add assets if they get insufficient to support the bonds. So this means they're a little different from an SPE. With an SPE, I pledge the assets, or excuse me, sell the assets to the SPE account. Okay, let's talk about the cash flow and the repayment of principal now. That structure I initially said was the primary structure we run into in corporate bonds is a bullet structure. Interest only on the coupon dates. All the principal is repaid at maturity. These are also referred to sometimes as plain vanilla bonds. There's nothing fancy about them. They pay interest only. The principal is repaid at the maturity date, whether that's 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years out. Now, an amortizing loan is what you're more familiar with a car loan, with a home loan. You make levels and a little bit of principal. I think we took a look at this in quant earlier. So that would be a fully amortizing security has equal payments. So if I go get a car loan for 48 months and that car payment is $350 a month, when I make that last $350 payment, I'm done. That's it. That last $350 payment is the last of the outstanding principal plus the last bit of interest. Well, we could have something in between the bullet structure and a fully amortizing structure called a partially amortizing structure. And so that would mean, well, you've got your level payments and they have some interest and principal in them, but at the end there's still some principal remaining. So partially amortizing just means, yes, the principal is amortized somewhat, that's reduced, paid off a little bit in each payment, but not completely or fully amortizing. Now, what's a sinking fund? Well, a sinking fund, it started out as a fund in which a borrower would put money to assure lenders that there would be some money there. Say it's a 20-year bond issue. Say it's a $20 million 20-year bond issue. You go, well, the company says they're going to have $20 million for us 20 years from now. How do we know that's true? So companies would set aside funds into a sinking fund, but in the absence of any legal structure, meaning they couldn't put their hands on that, as soon as they ran short of cash, they'd run to the sinking fund and take the money, as any of us would, of course. So the structure of a bond with a sinking fund now is typically that some portion of that bond issue is going to be retired. We also use the word redeemed periodically up until the maturity date, the final maturity date. So just a simple sinking fund structure says, okay, we're going to issue 20-year bonds. We're not going to do anything for 5 years. And then over the last 15 years of those bonds, we're going to retire 1/15, whatever 1/15 of that issue, that many bonds, that much face value of bonds each period. So we're retiring some bonds early on scheduled dates. And they can be redeemed at the par or face value. It could be that they're redeemed at a slight premium, okay, but often at par value. Well, this means that they aren't going to have to pay off the full 20 million or whatever the size of the bond issue was 20 years from now, that they're actually going to pay some off over time. Now, there's two ways to handle this sinking fund. The sinking fund provision is but option-free bond.